Lafia, Ashe, Ashe. Fanga, Lafia, Ashe, Ashe. Fanga, Lafia, Ashe, Ashe. Fanga, Lafia, Ashe, Ashe. Ashe, 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 Ashe. Ashe, 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 Ashe. Welcome to everyone with open arms. Peace, love, goodwill to you. We're glad you've come. Welcome to you. Welcome to you. Welcome to you. Welcome to you. Fanga, Lafia, Ashe, Ashe. Fanga, Lafia, Ashe, Ashe.
Welcome to you indeed.
And if you've come to sing, great. And if you've come to learn, you will. And if you've come to discover a more open, inclusive, compassionate vision for America, you are in the right place. And we are glad you've come.
Slavery wasn't new to the world in 1526 when Spaniards brought the first captive West Africans to what we today call the state of Georgia. From that time onward, black Americans have been demeaned, humiliated, marginalized, excluded, and robbed of human dignity, humanity, and life itself. Subjected to terror, violence, cruelty, arrogance, denied freedom, effective education, the right to vote, and choose where they wish to live, and often for long periods of time with spurious and sanctimonious justification by white people.
In 1,000 ways, people today are better off than in that long ago 1526. Yet racism and white supremacy continue to permeate our culture to diminish lives of people who are allegedly guaranteed equality and liberty. That is why we are here today in this place.
Fresh off the notorious Middle Passage, the forced importation of these bewildered and wretched human beings would continue for another 282 years, until 1808. Clearly, they carried no physical possessions, but they did bring their cultures, their rhythms, their songs, their dances, their familiarity with drums and banjo-like instruments. And they brought their traditional notion of Sankofa. Look to the past to guide us into the future. Look at history to understand what might, could, or will happen next.
Looking to the past offers the opportunity to examine broad swaths of time, perspective those living then could not grasp. But with hindsight, we get to see rhythms and patterns like reruns of a TV show. Pay close attention and note when familiar things occur over and again, often disguised as something new, a different look or angle, a sketchy, hard to grasp phrase or concept that doesn't quite make sense. Peel back the layers and we find it's about power. Who has it? How did they get it? And what do they do with it? Who's telling the story? And whose voice is missing?
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And And before I'd be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Tracking the timeline in your handout will help you grasp how today's world got this way. We will stitch together events and people and voices and phrases, words, court and legal decisions, and don't ignore mention of backlash, democracy, states' rights, and state legislatures, or references to the U.S. Supreme Court and justice, or lack of voices of voting rights and education and freedom and bondage, voices of hate and destruction and occasionally of celebration. A heads up, political parties shape-shift back and forth over the centuries. What they stand for today may not be what they once stood for. To avoid confusion, we'll try to tip you off when that occurs.
Please keep in mind that at times what you hear may be disturbing. Yet if history is to guide us to a more just and equitable future, we cannot pretend things didn't happen. Nor can we fail to notice how often the present feels like a rerun, an echo of the past. Should you feel a bit edgy, let's be clear. This is history. It's past. We are not personally responsible for what people who look like us did centuries ago, according to prominent black author Isabel Wilkerson. She further cautions this, but we are responsible for what good or ill we do to people alive with us today. We are responsible for our own ignorance, or with time and open-hearted enlightenment, our own wisdom.
That said, let's begin with the concept that each one of us can look at the world in two ways. First, that some people believe themselves better than others and therefore have the right, duty, or religious license to rule over everybody else. Perhaps like Virginia planter, slaveholder, and politician John Randolph, who proclaimed, "I am an aristocrat. I love freedom. I hate equality." On the other side are people who say, "No, we are all created equal, part of a shared humanity, and should have a voice in our lives and government, and, as well, a right to be treated equally before the law."
And that opens the door to this thing called race. What exactly is it, and where did it come from?
Let's go back to the mid-1700s. The age of foreign colonization and exploitation saw the rise of a European intellectual and cultural movement called the Age of Enlightenment. It emphasized reason over superstition, science over blind faith. Prior to that, people were identified by membership in a clan or a tribe or a kingdom or a locale or a religion. Whiteness wasn't recognized. In ancient Greece, the birthplace of democracy, it wasn't recognized in the Bible.
In 1684, a French physician contrived a theory he called race, that individuals could be distinguished by physical traits such as skin color. A Philadelphia physician measured human skulls and brains, seeking to correlate natural intelligence with brain size. His conclusion? African brains are smaller than those of white Caucasians, proof that they are a lesser species, a different race. So, naturally inferior to smarter white people. Considering the time in history, it provided a handy justification for those enslaving black human beings.
So race and whiteness, in truth, European intellectuals, writers, and scientists made it up. Both deceptive notions continue deeply embedded in our American culture to this very day.
In 1739, the Stono Slave Rebellion erupted in the colony of South Carolina. The human cost? 25 colonists and possibly 50 Africans. To thwart a repetition, the South Carolina legislature passed the Negro Act of 1740. It restricted slave assembly, education, movement, and the keeping of drums, horns, or other loud instruments which may give call or give sign or notice to one another, or the using of their wicked designs and purposes. In other words, to close down communication, to erase a people's language, to try to destroy their culture and eradicate their history.
On July 4th, 1776, American colonies declared their independence from England. Included in that document, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness."
Yet on that July 4th, approximately 500,000 black human beings were enslaved, owned by someone. By the turn of the century, that number would grow to nearly 1 million.
Some found slavery repugnant and worth fighting against. Prominent among them were the Quakers, the Society of Friends. Let's travel forward to 1805. A Quaker boy of 7 is standing on his father's farm, 3 miles from New Garden Quaker Meeting, now today is west of downtown Greensboro. A line of black men approaches from the north, manacled in couples to a long chain running between them. They're headed south to be sold to wealthy southern planters.
The boy's name is Levi Coffin. What he witnessed that day would wed him and the Quakers to what would become known as the Underground Railroad, one of the greatest civil disobedience movements in the history of our country. For more than 40 years, Levi Coffin helped more than 2,000 former slaves safely find their way to freedom in the North. Years later, he would be known as the president of the Underground Railroad. Estimates suggest that between 70,000 to 100,000 fugitive slaves were spirited off to freedom.
And escaping slavery, with or without the Underground Railroad, required a certain knowledge. Common songs were used to convey hidden, coded messages, perhaps signposts in the night sky. Freedom was usually north. Fact or fiction, a song similar to Follow the Drinking Gourd would suggest looking into the night sky for the group of stars shaped like a water dipper or a drinking gourd. The handle points to the North Star, so walk in the direction that the handle faces.
In the song you're about to hear, listen for Peg Leg Joe. Likely a mythical one-legged former sailor converted to Underground Railroad conductor. Perhaps this never happened, but freedom was a powerful vision. Escapees and those who aided them were certain to be creative and cunning. Maybe Joe really did mark escape routes in the charcoal of mud, the outline of human left foot followed by a round mark on the right, where his peg leg would have landed. The old man in this song is Peg Leg Joe.
Former slave turned abolitionist Harriet Tubman certainly was no fiction. She used the familiar spiritual hymn, Wade in the Water, to suggest traveling water whenever possible to confuse tracking dogs coming from behind.
When the sun comes up and the first quail calls, follow the drinking gourd. For the old man is a-waiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. For the old man is a-waiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd.
The river banks makes a mighty good road. The dead trees will show you the way. Left foot, peg foot, traveling on. Follow the drinking gourd.
The river ends between two hills. Follow the drinking gourd. There's another river on the other side. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd. For the old man is a-waiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd. Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water.
In 1808, the United States passed the act prohibiting importation of slaves. It did not end slavery itself, instead encouraged slave breeding and slave auctions throughout the South. We hear often in discussions of race and laws and eras the name Jim Crow. Who and what does that mean? Was there really a Jim Crow?
Around 1828, the traveling minstrel show phenomenon began. White males in blackface makeup performing comic skits, song, and dances. Black people would be maligned and ridiculed, presented as dim-witted, happy-go-lucky, lazy, superstitious. And shows like that became immensely popular all the way into the next century.
An early performer of minstrelsy was Thomas Daddy Rice, famous for a skit called Jump Jim Crow. History suggests Jim Crow was a black enslaved stable hand with a withered leg whom Rice had seen singing. After each verse, Jim Crow would make an awkward lunge or a jump. Rice appropriated the song, added verses, and perfected his own awkward and comical dance with a jump ending each chorus.
Come listen to me, boys and girls, it's just Kentucky Road. I'll sing a little song, my name's Jim Crow. Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. I went down to the river, didn't mean to stay, but there I seen so many gals I couldn't get away. Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. And after I've been there a while, I thought I'd push my boat, but I tumbled in the water, found myself afloat. Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. I whip my way to wildcats, eating alligators, drunk the Mississippi up on the very beach.
but a few decades, the name Jim Crow would become an infamous metaphor, a meme in present day, associated with restrictive black codes, which would arise all across the South after the Civil War. Before the 1830s, there were few legal restrictions on teaching slaves to read and write, but another slave revolt in 1831, maybe you've heard of it, the Nat Turner Rebellion, took the lives of approximately 60 whites. In retaliation, militia and mobs killed as many as 120 enslaved and free African Americans. After that, all slave states, except for Maryland, Kentucky, and Tennessee, passed laws against teaching slaves to read and write, and so keep them as ignorant and docile as might be possible.
Yet abolitionist and suffrage movements continued to grow, fueled in part when in 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe publishes her anti-slavery novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's the blockbuster expose of the age, the best-selling book of the 19th century, second only to the Bible. The tale of Eliza Harris and Simon Legree's purchase and eventual murder of Uncle Tom had a profound effect on the attitudes towards African Americans, slavery, and the Underground Railroad in America.
Years later, our old friend Levi Coffin of the Underground Railroad would write, Eliza Harris, the slave woman who appeared in Stowe's book, crossing the Ohio River near Ripley on the drifting ice with her child in her arms, was sheltered under our roof and fed at our table for several days. This was while we lived at Newport, Indiana, after leaving North Carolina.
It's September 1838 in Baltimore. A male slave disguised as a sailor boards a train bound for Delaware and transfers to a steamship and then a second train to New York City. It was his second and final escape attempt. On arrival, he would declare himself free from slavery. He'd adopt the name Frederick Douglass and spend his life as an abolitionist, journalist, author, orator, and human rights activist. In 1855, he published My Bondage and My Freedom, in which he wrote of singing spirituals during his years in bondage. A keen observer might have detected in our repeated singing of O Canaan, Sweet Canaan, I am bound for the land of Canaan, something more than a hope of reaching heaven. We meant to reach the north, and the north was our Canaan. Oh, the land I am bound for,
Sweet Canaan's happy land I am bound for. Sweet Canaan's happy land I am bound for. Sweet Canaan's happy land, pray give me your right hand. Oh, my brother, did you come for to help me? Oh, my sister, did you come for to help me? Oh, my brother, did you come for to help me? Pray and give me your right hand.
oh, the land I am bound for,
Sweet Canaan's happy land I am bound for. Sweet Canaan's happy land I am bound for. Sweet Canaan's happy land, pray and give me your right hand. After decades of simmering tensions over states' rights, slavery's westward expansion, and threats to nullify federal laws they didn't like, when it became clear that Abraham Lincoln had won the 1860 presidential election on December 20th, 1861, South Carolina's lawmakers walked their state out of the Union. Within 5 weeks, 6 more states followed suit. On February 8th, they ushered into existence the Confederate States of America. 7 states had left the Union when Lincoln was sworn into office on March 4th. 4 more were soon to follow, including North Carolina on May the 20th.
Several weeks after Lincoln's March 21 inauguration, Confederate States Vice President Alexander Stephens explains the rationale behind secession. Our new government is founded upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordinate to the superior race, is his normal and natural condition.
Not long afterward, at 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, a flaming mortar round from nearby Fort Johnson exploded over Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Confederate guns from fortifications and floating batteries roared to life. 34 hours later, the Union surrendered. The Civil War was on.
As the horrific war continues unabated, President Lincoln, through difficult and fragile negotiation with Congress, issues the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that, as of January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in the states currently engaged in rebellion against the Union shall thenceforth and forever be free. Afterward, he said this: I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper. If my name goes into history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it. Yet 2 more years of war will elapse before slavery is fully abolished in the country.
And that happens on January 31st, 1865, when Congress passed the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. It was ratified on December 6th and says, quote, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction.
Lincoln, fresh from winning a 2nd term in November, has been deliberating with Congress on how to bring the Confederate States back to the Union. If their side wins the war, the efforts bear no fruit. And after Lincoln's 2nd inauguration on March 4th, Congress adjourns and heads home until December. Darned if be a few weeks later, on April the 9th, Robert E. Lee surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, except for the surrender of the last major Confederate army in Galveston, Texas on June the 2nd, the inspiration for Juneteenth, the Civil War is over.
And then, only 5 days later, John Wilkes Booth, in a mad effort to save the Confederacy, shoots the president. Lincoln dies the following morning. Vice President Andrew Johnson is sworn into office. Johnson, a Southern Democrat born into poverty in North Carolina, supports ending slavery, yet he was a fervent racist and himself a former slaveholder. He'd write, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men." So Lincoln's dead, Congress is recessed. Johnson declines to call the members back to Washington. He begins writing a Reconstruction plan alone. That plan does not intend to enforce racial equality and will allow the southern states to begin holding elections and sending representatives back to Washington.
By summer 1865, President Johnson had pardoned all traitors and insurrectionists who have sworn allegiance to the Union, except high Confederate officials and individuals owning property in excess of $20,000. The latter had to petition the president personally for their pardons. The cost of war? Some 600,000 lives and $6 billion, yet no one was punished for their failed effort to destroy the country. In December, Johnson declared the Reconstruction process complete, but progressive abolitionist radical Republicans in Congress, now back in Washington, refused to seat more than 60 former Confederates who'd spent the past 4 years engaged in a deadly war to eradicate the Union.
These circumstances will soon prompt the addition of this clause into the 14th Amendment, a clause prominent in conversation right now in 2024. No person shall hold any office who, having previously taken an oath to support the Constitution, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof.
Despite their pardons, former Confederate veterans and sympathizers are outraged. They viewed Reconstruction, occupation by Union armies, and former slaves' freedom as humiliating and vindictive, pretending to be the ghosts of dead Confederate soldiers. They dressed in white robes and hoods and carried out nighttime terrorist raids against formerly enslaved people, employing intimidation, property destruction, assault, and even murder to determine black men from voting. And if you're wondering, yes, it is the story of the Ku Klux Klan, founded in Pulaski, Tennessee in 1865.
In 1868 and 1870, two more of what would become known as the Reconstruction Amendments, numbers 14 and 15, were passed and ratified. The former granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including former enslaved people, and guaranteed all citizens the equal protection of the laws. The latter protected the voting rights of all citizens, regardless of race or the color of their skin, including former slaves. Alas, all citizens did not include women. White women wouldn't get to vote until 1920, and most black women would wait 45 more years for the Voting Rights Act, which passed into law in 1965.
The two Reconstruction Amendments enabled black men to acquire land, seek their own employment, use public accommodations, open schools and colleges, participate in the political process, and of course, to vote. And vote they did, in numbers sufficient to win public offices across the South. In 1870, former South Carolina slave Joseph Rainey became the first black person to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives.
All these gains for newly freed black citizens set in motion a backlash when white-dominated state legislatures and local jurisdictions began writing what would become known as black codes, and by the 1870s, Jim Crow laws. Yep, that same wheel about and turnabout Jim Crow we met earlier.
Petty offenses like walking on the grass, vagrancy, stealing food, and looking at white people in the eye were criminalized. Former slaves were arrested and convicted and leased to plantations, mines, and factories, and brickyards, and railroads, and sometimes at the very place they'd been enslaved. Even those declared innocent by a court but unable to pay court fees were funneled into a convict leasing system. Outside Tallahassee, Florida, trains would be stopped, men rounded up, jailed, sentenced, and contracted out to turpentine and lumber outfits. Leasing fees guaranteed substantial amounts of revenue for southern states, county, and local budgets, and lasted through World War II.
Travel westbound on I-40 past Morganton to Old Fort, roughly where the Swannanoa Tunnel begins its westward march toward Asheville. It was built beginning in 1876 entirely by convicts, most of them black. When completed in 1879, some 3,000 inmates had been forced to work from sun up to sundown. At night, they slept in filthy railroad cars while bound in chains. A folk song called Swannanoa Tunnel became popular in the 1930s. There are lots of verses and iterations, but all go basically like this. I'm going back to
that Swannanoa Tunnel. That's my home. That's my home. Little Junction, Swannanoa Tunnel, all caved in, babe, all caved in. Last December, I remember, wind blow cold, babe, wind blow cold.
But it didn't begin like that. It was a work song, one of hundreds used to coordinate an action between multiple workers, heavy work aboard ships and mines or on railroads.
Opening our tunnel required drilling through rock for 1,832 feet with a handheld steel bit. A pair of hammermen alternated strikes, while a third man, the shaker, held the bit. While a second man raised his 9-pound hammer, the first man would strike the bit and immediately begin to raise his hammer. Hammer falling from my shoulder all day long, babe, all day long. 9-pound hammer killed John Henry. Can't kill me, babe, can't kill me. Some of these days I'll see that woman. Well, that's no dream, babe, that's no dream.
Upon reaching a certain depth, a mix of sawdust, cornmeal, and nitroglycerin was tamped into the hole, fuse lit, and the team would pray for a safe, effective explosion. Once detonated, they'd clean the rock away and start over again. As all this is going on, frustrated white Southerners begin applying political pressure, demanding redemption and a return to the old order. White males saw themselves as protectors of their women and way of life, and they turned to lynching and terror to control the black population.
Southern trees bear a strange fruit.
Lynching in America has documented more than 4,000 racial lynchings from the end of Reconstruction through 1950s.
Blood on the leaves and blood at the roots.
A spurious accusation, criminal or otherwise, will be followed by arrest or vigilante seizure, imprisonment, the gathering of a lynch mob. Victims were tortured, beaten, shot, then hanged from a tree, their bodies often set afire or dismembered for souvenirs.
Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze.
Lynchings were often public affairs, spectacles on the order of a carnival or athletic event, and were photographed for posterity and printed on postcards.
Strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees.
Time is too short to explain in detail, but in brief, the 1876 presidential election results were in dispute. Northern Republicans, what we would call today the Progressive Liberal Party of the era, agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South and thereby end Reconstruction if their candidate Rutherford B. Hayes was allowed to become president. That opened the door to white Democrat Redeemers, the Conservative Party, to consolidate control over the state legislatures throughout the South and reclaim their states from African Americans however they saw fit. The South slid back into the patterns of the antebellum pre-war era. Black historian W.E.B. Du Bois described the period as one where, quote, the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again toward slavery.
1894 saw the founding of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, a hereditary association for descendants of Confederate soldiers. Their purposes were three. One, to promote white supremacy through the mythical lost cause that the Civil War they'd started was heroic and not about slavery. Two, to preserve the honor of the South, its benevolent slave owners and contented enslaved people. And three, fund and erect monuments like Silent Sam at UNC Chapel Hill for state UDC chapters and for the Ku Klux Klan.
In 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court decided in Plessy v. Ferguson that racial segregation did not violate the equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment. This infamous separate but equal doctrine stated so long as the facilities provided to each race were equal, state and local governments could require that services, facilities, public accommodations, housing, medical care, education, employment, and transportation be segregated by race. Essentially, it upheld Jim Crow laws and legalized what became known as the segregation.
In 1898, Wilmington was one of North Carolina's largest cities, a mixed-rate seaport with black aldermen, police officers, and magistrates. In weeks leading up to November 8th elections, a group that includes the publisher of the Raleigh News and Observer, the chair of the Conservative Democratic Party, Klan leaders, and former Confederate officers organized a plot to disrupt the voting in the upcoming election. On November 8th, they turned loose 2,000 heavily armed redshirts, the vigilante arm of the Democratic Party, who surged through the city, burned the black-owned newspaper, terrorized women and children, and killed at least 60 black men.
Inciting the crowd beforehand, one of the instigators urged, quote, "Men, the crisis is upon us. You must do your duty. This city, county, and state shall be rid of Negro domination once and forever. You have the courage. You are brave. You are sons of noble ancestry. You are Anglo-Saxons. Go to the polls tomorrow, and if you find a Negro out voting, tell him to leave the polls. If he refuses, kill him. Shoot him down in his tracks."
Afterward, the Wilmington Messenger wrote, "Nevermore shall Sambo and Josh rule roughshod over white men who helped and befriended them. Henceforth, the rule of the white race will not only be asserted, but with benignancy and mercy. The rule of the master builders will be full of goodness and charity."
5 days after the killings in Wilmington, publisher Josephus Daniels welcomed thousands of white men and women across the state for a parade his Raleigh News and Observer called the Victory, White Supremacy, and Good Government Jubilee. The front page called the celebration the most remarkable demonstration ever seen at the Capitol. While the university band played Dixie, a sovereign badge was generously handed out, the top of which read, "White Supremacy, North Carolina Redeemed, November 8th, 1898.
The Wilmington Massacre wasn't the first, and by no means was it the last such event. 1919 would become the Red Summer, when thousands of black people were shot, lynched, and burned alive across more than 26 cities. In 1921, the single worst such incident occurred in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when the prosperous 35-block Greenwood district Black Wall Street was looted and burned to the ground by mobs of white residents, many armed and deputized by city officials. Weapons included a low-flying plane, shooters spraying bullets from aloft. When it was over, the white rioters went home and pretended it never happened. It would be nearly 100 years before the carnage and destruction became public.
In 1915, the silent movie Birth of a Nation premiered. Set during Reconstruction, the film portrays heroic Ku Klux Klan Southern whites, Northern politicians who wanted to disenfranchise them, and violence committed by former slaves. A huge commercial success across the nation, the movie was screened in the White House by staunch segregationist President Woodrow Wilson, his family, and members of his cabinet. The final song in the soundtrack, Ride of the Klansman and Triumph.
Weary of Jim Crow segregation laws, lack of education opportunities, unmet promises of Reconstruction, menial labor, low wages, and segregation at every turn, blacks fled the terror of the South in what would become known as the Great Migration. It wasn't lost on them that an African American was being lynched every 4 days somewhere south of the Mason-Dixon line. Over the next 40 years, some 6 million black people left the South to build communities, churches, businesses, and schools elsewhere, and in so doing, reshaped America's racial distribution.
Shortly after the new century began, gospel and blues singer Vera Hull was born in Sumter County, Alabama. Her mother, a former slave. In 1937, she would cross paths with the Library of Congress songcatcher John Lomax and record Trouble So Hard, a song that spoke to life in the South when the Jim Crow movement was in full throttle.
Oh, Lord, it troubles so hard.
Oh, Lord, it troubles so hard.
Don't nobody know my troubles but God.
Don't nobody know my troubles but God.
I went to the river the other day to pray. My soul got happy and it stayed all day.
Went in the room, didn't stay long. Looked for brother and he was gone.
Oh, Lord, it troubles so hard.
Oh, Lord, it troubles so hard.
Don't nobody know my troubles but God.
Don't nobody know my troubles but God. Don't nobody know my troubles but God. Don't nobody know my troubles but God.
In June 1934, German Nazi lawyers gathered to begin writing the notorious anti-Jewish Nuremberg laws. For nearly a decade, they've been studying Jim Crow laws of the American South, those praised by Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf that created a second-class citizenship for blacks, Puerto Ricans, Filipinos, Chinese, and Native Americans.
More than 1.2 million African Americans served the country in World War II. Yet, upon arriving home, they were subjected to incidents like one experienced by Sergeant Isaac Woodard. He was riding a bus home to North Carolina in 1946, still in uniform, and carrying his honorable discharge papers. He was attacked by South Carolina police, arrested, beaten, and permanently blinded by Police Chief Linwood Shull. The assault sparked national outrage and galvanized the U.S. civil rights movement. South Carolina refused to pursue the case. So President Harry Truman ordered a federal investigation. Scholl was indicted, tried, and then acquitted by an all-white jury.
8 years later, in 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court decided in Brown v. Board of Education that state laws which established racial segregation in public schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, even if the segregated schools were otherwise equal in quality. This was a huge win for equality, but
Within hours, Southern white political leaders vowed to defy the decision. Virginia Senator Harry Byrd called it the most serious blow that has yet been struck against the rights of states in a matter vitally affecting their authority and welfare. We are facing a crisis of the first magnitude. In November, while not stipulating a method for ending segregation, the court directed federal district judges to implement desegregation with all deliberate speed.
Virginia Governor Thomas Stanley and the state legislature put up roadblock upon roadblock. They ginned up an action called massive resistance, legislation to force the closure of any school that planned to comply with the Brown Court decision and close the schools they did across the state.
Prince Edward County shuttered its 21 public schools and diverted tax revenues to pay for white students to attend a new private segregated academy. If that sounds like the voucher programs of today, that's exactly what it was. On the first day of school in September 1959, 14 buses helped ferry 1,475 white students to the new private academy, while 1,700 black children stood and watched. It took 5 years for courts to overturn the policy. By then, black literacy rate for those aged 5 to 22 had jumped from 3 to 23%. The shutdown was widely condemned as a national disgrace.
About that time, an 8-year-old black boy in Georgia recalls his grandmother fretting over the horror and the pain she and other black folks felt over the brutal lynchings, burnings, mutilations, castrations, shootings, and just senseless murders of black men, women, and children. This almost 91 years since emancipation and the end of the Civil War. She had a deep fear and distrust of whites and instilled in her family the importance of spending lots of time at home, not on the unsafe and potentially violent streets of Augusta. Safe at home, Grandma was always singing. Among her favorite hymns was Amazing Grace, authored by a man who once captained a slave ship. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I am found. Was blind, but now I see. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Twas grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. When we've been here 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less grace to sing God's praise
By the early 1960s, tensions were mounting over racial barriers in education and public transportation and the use of public accommodations in restaurants and theaters. In 1963, following incidents of harsh treatment toward peaceful protesters by the police and the murders of civil rights activists, President John F. Kennedy reluctantly called for a meaningful civil rights bill. While negotiations were locked down in a filibuster, Senate Kennedy was assassinated.
Prodded by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Kennedy's successor, President Lyndon B. Johnson, took up the cause. And the Civil Rights Act was passed in the House and Senate in 1964. It prohibited discrimination in hiring, promoting, and firing on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and addressed voting rights, employment, public accommodations, and education. A much-needed step forward, certainly. But in 1965, Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot trying to stop an Alabama state trooper from beating his mother as she marched for the right to vote. Jackson died 8 days later. During his funeral, he was called a martyred hero of a holy crusade for freedom and human dignity.
To protest the shooting and denial of voting rights, leaders planned a peaceful march of 54 miles from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery. They take their cause directly to George Wallace, despite his promise to use whatever measures are necessary to prevent a march. And Wallace wasn't bluffing. On March 7, marchers crossed the Alabama River on the Edmund Pettus Bridge to find a line of state and county officers poised to attack. When demonstrators did not immediately obey in order to turn back, troopers brutally attacked them on horseback, wielding weapons and chasing down fleeing men, women, and children. Dozens were hospitalized with severe injuries, and the day would be forever known as Bloody Sunday.
2 days later, Dr. Martin Luther King led roughly 2,500 people back to the Pettus Bridge. But, obeying a court order, he turned the marchers around. That restraint gained the support of President Johnson, who said, Americans everywhere join in deploring the brutality with which a number of Negro citizens of Alabama were treated when they sought to dramatize their deep and sincere interest in attaining the precious right to vote. Johnson promised to introduce a voting rights bill to Congress within a few days. During the marchers, protesters continued to sing the anthem of the movement. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall live in peace someday.
Despite Wallace's vile obstinance, on March 25, 25,000 marchers protected by 3,000 military, policemen, and Army troops did reach the Alabama State Capitol building and with a petition for Wallace. King's reaction? The end we seek is a society at peace with itself, a society that can live with its conscience. That will be a day not of the white man, not of the black man. That will be a day of man as man.
And then, as promised, President Lyndon Johnson signs into law 1965 Voting Rights Act on August the 6th. It would overturn state and local legal barriers which had prevented African Americans from voting as guaranteed by the 15th Amendment, ending literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and the like. And it gave the federal government authority to pre-approve voting and election changes in states with histories of discrimination, like North Carolina. It was and remains so today one of the most far-reaching pieces of civil rights legislation in United States history.
But, like so many earlier occasions, backlash began anew. That which has followed almost every advancement by and for African Americans, it wouldn't be the last.
Considering the times, should we even wonder why Gil Scott-Heron, a young black man, would write something like, "The revolution will not be televised"?
The revolution will not be brought to you by Xerox in 4 parts without commercial interruptions, and will not star Natalie Wood and Steve McQueen or Bullwinkle and Julia.
The revolution will not make you look 5 pounds thinner because the revolution will not be televised, brother.
There will be no pictures of pigs shooting down brothers in the instant replay. There will be no pictures of pigs shooting down brothers on the instant replay.
There will be no pictures of Whitney Young being run out of Harlem on a rail with a brand new process.
And women will not care if Dick finally got down with Jane on Search for Tomorrow.
Because black people will be in the street looking for a brighter day.
The revolution will not be televised. The theme song will not be written by Jim Webb or Francis Scott Keys. The revolution will not be televised.
The revolution will not be right back after a message about a white tornado, white lightning, or white people.
The revolution will put you in the driver's seat.
The revolution will not be televised. Will not be televised. Will not be televised. Will not be televised.
The revolution will be no rerun, brothers.
The revolution will be live.
The newest bronze statue on the Sugar Creek Greenway across Kings Drive from Baskin-Robbins remembers Charlotte's Julius Chambers. Born in 1936 in Mount Gilead, North Carolina, Julius charted a course to practice law after a white man refused to pay for work at his father's auto repair shop. His path went through North Carolina Law School, the first black man in its history.
Over his career, Julius argued and won 7 cases at the U.S. Supreme Court. Among them was Swan v. Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education in 1971. It ruled that busing was an appropriate remedy to ensure schools would be properly integrated, though neighborhoods were not, and that all students, regardless of race, would receive equal educational opportunities.
Right. In 1999, Swan is reversed in court when a parent sues the Mecklenburg County School Board after his daughter is classified as non-black and denied entry into an elementary school magnet program. As predicted, schools immediately begin to resegregate.
After nearly a decade of trying, former Vice President Richard Nixon has finally made it to the White House. The Vietnam War is raging, but so is anti-war protest. Nixon's popularity is in decline, and he's seeking a way to deflect criticism. told of a growing heroin epidemic among U.S. troops in Southeast Asia, he proclaims drug abuse America's public enemy number one and declares a war on drugs, an all-out offensive that greatly increases penalties, enforcement, and incarceration for drug offenders.
And guess who's at the top of the target list? Years afterward, top Nixon aide John Ehrlichman reveals this. You want to know what this was really about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Do we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
10 years later, in 1981, Ronald Reagan is president and decides to escalate the war on drugs. The prison population explodes. When he took office in 1980, the total prison population was 329,000. 8 years later, when he left office, it had nearly doubled to 627,000. Hardest hit and disproportionately incarcerated were communities of color. That remains true to this very day. Prisons quickly became overcrowded, and get this, a for-profit prison industry emerges. Corporations are paid a daily fee for each prisoner housed.
Which means they need more customers, more prisoners, more money.
That's right. And to keep the prisoner pipeline full, corporations generously supported local law enforcement agencies, political candidates, and political action committees. Today, our country incarcerates more people than any nation in the world, including China, though only making up 13.4% of the total U.S. population. Black inmates make up nearly 40% of the prison population.
And while in a similar vein, how about the militarization of law enforcement agencies? You walk down the street and see an armed vehicle with police or sheriff painted on the side and wonder, what are police doing with weapons of war in our streets? Tactical, mine-resistant vehicles, M4 and M16 rifles, helicopters, pistols, night vision goggles, machetes, and riot shields? In 1990, the federal government rolled out the Law Enforcement Militarization 1033 program to transfer surplus military equipment to non-military law enforcement agencies. Initially projected for use in drug law enforcement, it was later expanded to include counter-drug and counter-terrorism.
Upon becoming president, Bill Clinton further escalates the drug and crime wars. Pitching wars of any sort are always big sellers. And then on November the 4th, 2008, 482 years after the first black enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to this land, an African-American man, Barack Obama, is elected president of the United States. Truly a monumentous and joyous milestone. Sadly, the backlash to advancements by black citizens, so often prevalent in our history, begins again.
It starts in 2010 with something called the Redistricting Majority Project, or Red Map. Its purpose, to increase Republican Party control over congressional seats in states' legislatures. It's eerily reminiscent of the Civil War's Reconstruction termination in 1876. The tool this time, the age-old practice of gerrymandering, rigging election district boundaries to guarantee political control and the never-ending cry for states' rights. It's a cursed cancer behind both the federal government's inability to function and the ruthless power plays of single-party states determined to dismantle the people's democracy.
In the same year, the U.S. Supreme Court in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission overturned election spending limits put in place more than 100 years ago to prevent corruption. The ruling opened the floodgates to massive increases in political and dark money spending from wealthy donors, corporations, and special interest groups. The relentless string of political action committees, or PACs. In the just completed 2024 elections, outside spending on federal races hit $4.5 billion, half from groups with undisclosed sources. One individual spent $200 million on the winning presidential candidate.
3 years later, in 2013, that same U.S. Supreme Court gutted crucial Section 2 pre-clearance requirement of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And is it any wonder that voter suppression laws explode? The justices left it to Congress to update the legislation, but Congress hadn't touched it. By June 2023, legislators in all 50 states have introduced, pre-filed, or carried over 411 restrictive voting bills.
It's May 25th, 2020, and George Floyd, a 46-year-old black man, is detained when a store checker accused Floyd of passing a counterfeit $20 bill, while a white Minneapolis police officer kneeled on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. A bystander filmed the incident on a cell phone. Floyd was suffocated to death. Another in a long string of deaths at the hand of law enforcement officers. This one set off massive outrage across the United States.
In the weeks that followed, demonstrations took place in more than 2,000 cities and towns in all 50 states and in major cities across the globe. In my hometown of Charlotte, 3,000 human beings of all ages and colors marched through our most exclusive neighborhood and stopped to take a knee together for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. As I wrote in the Charlotte Observer, white people and professional athletes with courage, compassion, and brotherly vision risked criticism, financial loss, and friendships by standing together to voice outrage over treatment of black and brown people across our land. Finally, I recall thinking, the ground has shifted.
Blues singer Big Bill Broonzy would have felt that ground shift. He died in 1958 at age 65 and probably never had such a day. Here's what Big Bill was saying in the 40s and the 50s.
This little song that I'm singing about, people all know it's true. If you're black and you gotta work for a living now, this is what they're saying to you. They said if you're white, you're alright. If you're brown, stick around. But if you're black, oh brother, get back, get back, get back. Me and a man was working side by side, and this is what it meant. They was paying him $1 an hour, they was paying me 50 cents. And if you's white, you're alright. If you're brown, stick around. But if you're black, oh brother, get back, get back, get back. Help win sweet victories, with my plow and my hoe. Now I want you to tell me, brother, what you gonna do about the old Jim Crow. Said if you's white, you're alright. If you're brown, stick around. If you're black, oh brother, get back, get back, get back.
And there it is. The gist of it all. What you going to do about the old Jim Crow? In 2024, 4 years after George Floyd's death, our United States isn't very united. Trouble so hard indeed. Crippling polarization, economic disparity, rigorous suffocation of public education, voter suppression, police killings, warped justice, systemic racism, regardless of what the Supreme Court decrees, and a fire hose of lies, disinformation, and propaganda. Our democracy is under ferocious siege. Those who have worked so hard for so many centuries to make the lives of black people miserable and to thwart the human potential are formidable. The rhythms of history have not settled. Outrage over critical race theory, dismantling of action, attacks on teaching black history, and an all-out effort to eradicate diversity, education, and inclusion initiatives fill the news and media. It's clear that racism and white supremacy remain stubbornly alive.
In Wichita, Kansas, Youth Baseball League 42 awoke to find Jackie Robinson's memorial bronze statue missing. Severed at the ankles, the shoes were all that remained. The rest of the statue was found nearby several days later, dismantled and burning in a trash can. Remember that Jackie Robinson was the first African American to play in the major leagues, to be enshrined in Major League Baseball's Hall of Fame. Robinson's number, 42, is permanently retired. The league administrator reflected, "This is a sacred place, a place where we honor a man who broke down barriers and did things that had never been done before."
This happened in 2024 to a youth baseball league that makes the sport available to all. They were just kids. Why?
The road ahead is uncertain. But here's the thing. Tomorrow has yet to happen. The wisdom of Sankofa, let the past guide us into the future, remains possible. We can recast the script when we refuse to accept any more of the way it once was. Our country's promise to each of us is that ours is a government of the people, by the people, for the people, and it shall not perish from the earth. It's our job every day to refuse to let anyone take it from us.
As we finish up, let's eavesdrop on this conversation from Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin.
2 male passengers are traveling to the deep south aboard a steamboat. Also aboard, the vicious planter Simon Legree and his newly purchased slaves, including Uncle Tom. The men, one of the south, the other of the north, are discussing Legree's cruel treatment of his new property.
The Yankee notes critically, "He is a mean, low, brutal fellow," to which the Southerner responds, "Yes, but there are also many considerate and humane men among the planters." "Granted," says the other, "but in my opinion, it's you considerate, humane men that are responsible for all the brutality and outrage wrought by these wretches, because if it were not for your sanction and influence, the whole thing would go down like a millstone. It's your respectability and your humanity that licenses and protects his brutality."
If Martin Luther King was looking on, he'd nod and offer this coda. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter.
To that, Irish statesman Edmund Burke might add, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for the good men to do nothing."
So we all play a role here. We stand up or we shut up. We stop and help or we look away and drive by. We ignore or reach out to pick up another human being. Do we find a way to get in the way of hate, dishonesty, ignorance, and greed, or do we privately tell ourselves it's not my problem? The truth is, racism is every human's problem, and we're at our best when we don't lose sight of each other's humanity. Deep, heartfelt thanks from the four of us, Kel Williams, Sandra Porter Thomas, Nick Tutwiler, and me, I'm Harry Taylor, for visiting Trouble So Hard. Please pass on what you heard and learned and visit our website. It's chock full of images, maps, links, and resources. And join us as we close with this thought-provoking song from Charlotte's own Cy Khan, What Will I Leave?
Late in the evening as light fades away, in silence we gather together, searching the faces of those who are here, for those who have left us forever. What will I leave? What will I leave? What will I leave behind? When I am gone, who will carry on? What will I leave behind? Who will remember the words of the brave who lifted us higher and higher? Who will remember the price that they paid for lives lived too close to the fire? Hearts of the ones who inherit your lives will rest in the truth you have spoken. Memory will echo the trust that you kept. Like you, it will never be broken. What will I leave? What will I leave? What will I leave behind? When I am gone, who will carry on? What will I leave behind? When I am gone, who will carry on? What will I